Good evening. So the next story, and we're kind of migrating towards the bottom of Ayin Gimel Amud Beis, page 73b in Bava Basra, says as follows. Again, V'amar Rabba bar bar Chana, Rabba bar bar Chana said, Zim Nechada, one time, Hava Azlinan Besfinta, we were traveling on a ship. V'chazinan Ahut Sifra, and we saw a bird, Dekoim ad kartsule bimaya, that was standing ankle deep in the water. Vireshe birakia, and the head of the bird was in the sky. Vamrinan, and we said, lekamaya, looks like there's no water here. Ubeinan lochos, and we wanted to go down into the water, la kuri nafshin, to cool ourselves off. Vinafik baskala, and a voice came out from heaven. Va'amar lan, and said to us, Lo sechusu hacha, do not come down here. Dinaflas lechatzina lebar nagra, because one time an axe belonging to a carpenter fell here. Hasheva shani, 7 years ago, and it's still falling through the waters. Velo kamatya ara, and it hasn't landed at the bottom of this body of water. However, V'lav mishum denafishi maya, the reason why it hasn't landed is not because the waters here are so deep, ela mishum de radfi maya, but because of the fact that the waters are running fast. Amar Ravashi, and Ravashi commentated how who ziz shakai hu, or ziz shadai, depending if you feel it's Hashem's name or not. That's a type of a bird called a ziz shadai. T'chsiv, as the pasuk says in Tehillim, v'ziz shadai imadi, the ziz shadai is with me. So what in the world is this story talking about? So Reb Moshe ben Yamin of Bavel, and we're actually going to share two approaches of his, but the first one is going to be a pshat level approach. He says that this bird standing in the water is an allusion to a Torah scholar who sits in peace and joy studying Torah like a bird on its nest. And one of the reasons why the bird is in such a good mood when it's on its nest is because it knows that it's in the meantime raising a new generation of birds. So too, as the Torah scholar studies and teaches, he knows that he is bringing life to himself and others. And we find the converse of this metaphor, that in Chagiga, the Gemara says that someone who studies Torah and then abandons Torah study is like a bird that wandered from its nest. And so that's why he understands that over here, when the story describes the bird as sitting on its nest, it means that it is still engaged in the study of Torah. And it's not budging. And he's standing. Why? Because when the bird is over its nest, as the pasuk says, Al gozalav yirachef, that it hovers over its chicks, and the Gemara describes it as nogeya ve'eno nogeya, that the bird is kind of touching the chicks and not really, because the bird doesn't want to crush the chicks that are underneath it. And this particular Torah scholar, who's making sure to educate his students properly by not quite sitting on top of them, but being on top of them at the same time, it's clear that his head is in the right place. And that's why the story described his head as being in the clouds, as being in the heaven. And when Rabba and the ship approached this bird, or approached this Torah scholar, and they wanted to learn from his behavior, they were having difficulty really relating to him and learning from him, because since his head was all the way high up, he didn't realize they were there. And his head was in the clouds because he was busy beseeching heaven for understanding in his Torah study. And these people are looking at him and they figured, oh, well, we can accomplish the same thing as he can in the Torah study, because they didn't have the experience of learning to understand the complexity that involves in becoming a true Torah scholar. And that's why they said, less Maya, there's no water over here. It's no big deal. And they said, let's go in there and refresh ourselves by engaging in some Torah study. And that's why the voice came out from heaven and said, hey guys, you're not on his level. And that's why I used the parable of the axe that was taking 7 years to sink, to say that this person had spent 7 years working on coming up with an understanding of certain areas of Torah, and had still not succeeded. And that's why his head was up in the clouds, because he was focused on trying to understand these things. And Rav Moshe ben Yamin Bavel continues to say that the point of the story is to emphasize that a person should not just study Torah in a superficial way, but rather he should be delving into his learning and to make sure he understands the reasoning behind everything. Even if it takes many years of returning to the topic and studying the topic over and over again until you really understand it. And he has to be, we said the name of the bird was a ziz. A ziz is also a word for a peg. He has to be stubborn and firm in his pursuit of understanding, like a peg in a wall that doesn't budge. Another possible explanation he offers is that when they saw his head was in the clouds, they assumed that he was a Baal Gaiva. He was someone who was full of himself. As it says in the pasuk of Lo Bashamayim, he that the Torah is not in heaven, is that the Torah is not in people who lift themselves up as if they're in heaven. But then he said they remembered that it also says V'lo re'ever le'yam, that the Torah is also not on the other side of the ocean, on which the Medrash says you won't find Torah and people who spend all their day traveling on ships for business. So they said we're being hypocrites. If we're saying he shouldn't have any Torah because he's a show-off, well, we're also not going to have any Torah because we're traveling for business. So they decided to get off the ship to learn Torah, and the voice came down from Shemayim and said, you've completely misunderstood this person. He is not a show-off, and you can get off the ship all you want, but you're not going to reach his depth and level of Torah study. The Eitz Yosef, Olalos Ephraim, and Ben Yehoyada all take similar approaches, that this story is an allusion to someone who sees a person who is studying Sod, who is studying Kabbalah, and says, I want to learn that as well. So they're traveling through the waters of Torah, and they see a bird. That's a reference to a holy person who, while his feet were anchored in the waters of the revealed Torah, his head was up in the clouds studying the secrets of the Torah. And we said, there's no water. It's very easy to pick up the revealed Torah, but right now we want to refresh ourselves and inspire ourselves. We want to learn the hidden Torah. And so again, a voice is coming down from heaven and warning them that if that's their attitude about the revealed Torah, that there's not much there, they don't stand a chance of understanding the secrets of the Torah. Because they have to immerse themselves for many years in the revealed Torah, and not necessarily because of the quantity of the material, because of its depth and difficulty. In the Emes Yaakov, he understands that this Gemara is referring to the fact that as the generations go on, we find more and more people who don't believe in the Torah and try to do things to oppose the Torah. And Chazal tell us, Ein meshivin la'api chorus, that you shouldn't try to respond to a non-believer. because if a person has set his mind determinedly down a particular path, it's kind of hopeless to convince them. And therefore, this person was speaking to a bird, a Torah scholar, someone who had only dipped his feet in the water, but had his heads in the clouds, because even though he hadn't learned much, he was very enamored with what he had learned. And he had no water, really. He had very little genuine Torah knowledge. And Rabba wanted to point that out to him, but a voice came out from Shemayim and said, don't even bother. Someone already tried for 7 years to explain to him that his depth of Torah knowledge is not what he thinks it is, and didn't get any place. And not because of the fact that the person who was trying to educate him lacked knowledge, but because the person who really didn't know as much as he thought he knew, he was running fast and dodging and refusing to really confront the questions that were posed to him. One more explanation, again from Rabbi Moshe Binyamin of Bavel. This is a more Kabbalistic explanation. He wants to say that the bird is a metaphor for the Shechina, for the presence of Hashem. As the pasuk says, "V'gam tzipor matza'a bayis," that the bird found a house. That during Golus, while Klal Yisrael is in exile, the Shechina wanders around, and it's actually invested in the 10 spheros from the side of Tumah. And a similar thing occurs to the neshamos of the tzaddikim. And in every generation, some of the neshamos are given an opportunity to be fixed. Each time from different parts of the body, depending on what needs to be rectified in that location and that time. That's why we have the concept of ikvasa de Mashiach, which literally means the times of Mashiach. But the word ikvasa is also based on the word ekev, meaning the heel. Because before Mashiach comes, it's the spiritual heel that is going to need rectifying. That's why the Gemara also says there's going to be a lot of chutzpah prior to the coming of Mashiach, because the heel is the toughest, most unrelenting, difficult physical part of the body. And the bird is the Shechina before the time of Mashiach, and the water, he understands, is a metaphor for the klipos, the forces of evil that are still covering its feet. But the head is in the sky, because even in Golus, the Shechina has not completely left its place and is not only among the klipos. Most of the Shechina is still in the holy places. It's only part of it that's stuck in the klipos. And the people seeing this, they thought, less Maya, there's no water. Looks like the klipos are already done for. And that it'd be very easy to get rid of the rest of them and bring about the geula. That was what they thought when they said they were going to refresh themselves. But the Bas Kol warned them that even though they were tzaddikim and they had the ability to create a tikkun, to create a rectification, but their ability to do so would only be on a limited scale. Not because prior to the coming of Mashiach that there's so much evil in the world that needs to be gotten rid of. Actually, the quantity of evil is less. But because that which remains at this point in time is evil that's much more difficult to overcome than that which existed previously. Thank you so much for listening.